Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Professor Joseph Ellis. Pro- Professor Ellis has been a professor of history for almost all his life. He has been an author of 10 books focused on American history. He has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. He has written uh, reviews and essays on New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Chicago Tribune, and today we will speak about his latest book, The Cause, The American Revolution and Its Discontent, 1773 to 1783. Professor Ellis, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
So you have been teaching and writing about history almost forever. Can you tell us about those early years where you were trying to decide what to do with your life and then you decided to become a historian?
I grew up in Northern Virginia and went to college at the College of William and Mary. And towards the end of my career at college, I kept saying, when people asked me, what are you going to do? And I said, I think I'm going to go to law school. And then I realized I don't have the money to go to law school. I can't afford to go to law school. But I was successful as a student in a way that gave me a scholarship to go on to graduate school. And heaven knows why, I was admitted by Yale University. And I hadn't even majored in history, but that's what I went on in. And I've been in New England ever since. I see myself as a teacher of undergraduates who aren't necessarily going to be historians, but are going to be citizens in the world. And I see my role as a teacher to provide them with the opportunity to read and to argue and to develop an infectious enthusiasm for a study of the past. And I carry that same set of convictions and goals into my writing. Many American historians, that is, card-carrying historians like I am, are writing to each other because professionally that makes eminent sense. That's how you get tenure, promotion, etc. I'm writing to a larger audience, I think, of intelligent or interested readers in American history. And many American historians are reporting on their research because it takes so long to do the research. They want to share it with readers. That's usually a mistake in my view. You have to ask the question, what is the story? And you have to be able to throw away a lot of note cards, which I do, and write books that are not longer than 300 pages and that provide the reader with real live people and stories about them that will be of interest and address a broader set of issues than some historians are prepared to address.
I took a look at your Amazon page where I saw this about 10 books I think I saw, and most of them are from a particular time in history, which is the time of the American Revolution. Why do you focus on this time? I mean, the history of the United States is vast. It has many compartments.
Right,
Why
right.
do you choose this area?
I'll give you quite an anecdote that will answer that. There was a famous bank robber in American history named Willie Sutton. He kept being arrested after he tried to rob banks and thrown in jail. And so people said, Willie, why do you keep robbing banks? And he said, because that's where they keep the money. The late 18th century is the big bang in American history. It creates the institutions and the values that continue to abide, continue to be the framework for our own republic. And I think the generation that came of age in the founding era is the most creative and influential generation of political leaders in American history. And as I was reaching maturity as a historian, they were publishing the papers of all these people. So we know more about them as a political elite than any political elite in recorded history. So I did it because we know so much about them and because I think our origins as a people and a nation are the founding principles that we continue to debate and discuss.
Okay, well, then you you came to the decision to write this book, The Cause?
Hmm.
Why this book and why now?
I didn't know what I was doing at the beginning of my career when I started writing, and I wrote biographies of the first three presidents, Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. What I was doing was beginning to write a history of the American founding, that is, the Revolution, the Constitution, and the creation of a stable republic. And I was effectively doing it backwards, chronologically. And the book I've just finished is chronologically what should have been the first book. But in the same way that a writer often, and I almost always, writes the preface of his book last, because you don't know where you're going until you've done it, I've written this chapter of the founding last because now I know where it leads. And I don't think I would have been able to write the same book 30 or 40 years ago that I did now. And so it's my final entry in the culmination of a career trying to tell the story of the American founding.
Okay, and can you tell the listeners why you choose that title, The Cause?
I choose the title The Cause because no one at the time called what we call the American Revolution, the American Revolution. The British called it the American Rebellion. The Americans began to call it the Common Cause, and then the Cause. And the Cause was a term that allowed a whole bunch of different interest groups and different people from different colonies to come together under one banner. And it ultimately meant American independence. That was its core meaning, a commitment to secession from the British Empire. That came only at the end, however. And it did have a kind of political agenda, more than a kind of a political agenda, that had radical implications about women's rights, about the end of slavery, about human rights for all citizens, about the end of the property qualification to vote. And those rights were delayed. This was unlike the French Revolution that attempted to implement its agenda immediately. And I call the American revolutionaries prudent revolutionaries, which is usually considered a contradiction in terms. So in some sense, the American Revolution succeeded, what we call the American Revolution, because the cause deferred the full implications of its movement into the future. I think that was a brilliant decision because it didn't fall victim to the same consequence as the French Revolution with Napoleon or the Russian Revolution with Stalin and Lenin. On the other hand, with regard to the issue of slavery, they misread the future. They really thought slavery was going to die a natural death. They didn't foresee the cotton gin or the cotton kingdom. They thought they were on the road to putting slavery into, to an end, and they misread that. And we're still suffering with the implications of that decision because the slavery is the original sin of American history. The founders are the greatest generation, and they failed in this respect to end it. And racism is the toxic residue of that failure, and that's still, of course, very much with us in the United States.
Right. When we think of the United States right now, we think of one singular country, the United States of America. But at this time, that was not the case. The United States were a series of random states put together, not with an agenda. Each one of those states had a different agenda. Can you talk about that?
Yes.
Too?
Yeah. Initially, the cause was we, the 13 colonies, will come together temporarily, provisionally, to win the war. And then we will go our separate ways back to individual states. And to some extent, that's exactly what happens, because the government created at the end of the war is called the Articles of Confederation. It's not a nation. The first sentence in the most famous speech in American history, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, is historically incorrect. 77 years ago, he said, meaning 76, fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. No, we weren't a nation. And the support for the war suffered as a result because we were never able to mobilize complete support for the Continental Army or for the financial support needed. In fact, if this broadcast hits France, without France, we could have never won the war. France really paid for the war and supported it in many other ways. And at the end of the war, the term United States is a plural noun. They didn't say the United States is, they said the United States are. And the kind of government that exists at the end of the war is not much of a government at all. It's really it's sort of like somewhat a version of the EU, where sovereignty does not reside in the central body at all. There is, during the war, a group of people that include major figures like Washington, Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, who believe that the war, the cause, the American Revolution has come to must mean American nationhood. Otherwise, all the advantages of the war will be lost. We picked apart by foreign countries and dissolve into a series of confederations. But they're a real minority. The dominant view is any federal government that oversees all of the states is a foreign government. And we thought we just fought this war to oppose Parliament England's right to do that. And therefore, we don't want to establish a domestic version of the same tyranny. That's the dominant view at the end of the war. And it's one of the reasons the title of the war is, and it's Discontents, because at the end of the war, we're not a nation. And that means that if the two tragedies of the war are to be solved, that is, avoiding Indian removal and reaching putting slavery on the road to extinction, it's going to be very difficult to do that because there is no federal government empowered to make laws for all the states. And even after the Constitution, that issue is going to be a difficult one for the states who presume sovereignty. And it's not just a kind of ideological view, it's a view that fits the experience of most Americans. Most Americans at the time in the late 18th century were born, lived out their lives, and died within a 3-day horse ride. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have radios. And so their own sense of a political identity was local. And therefore, they were extremely suspicious of any government far away that ruled over them in ways, again, that Parliament supposedly did.
Well, and today we have local governments or states that oppose they are anti-federal. For example, we have governments who says that no, we don't want to take orders from Washington and wear masks. Right. We are not going to accept Washington's tyranny.
Yeah, you still, the tradition that comes out of the cause and the revolution is still alive. That is the belief there's a two-track world here. One, in simple, I hope not simplistic way to do it, is that is government them or is government us? And most of the people who are easily converted to us mean only for the people they can see that are their neighbors, etc. I think that the pattern over time is them tends to dominate in American history, except when there's a real crisis. And when there's a real crisis, World War II would be such a crisis, then there's unity. In some ways, the pandemic. But I think that from a purely constitutional point of view, the states' rights argument lost not in the courts, but on the battlefield of the Civil War. And the South lost that battle, but in some ways they won the peace, but because they consistently maintained their own sovereignty after that with Jim Crow legislation. So it's an ongoing argument within American history. that starts at the founding.
Well, one thing that I find surprising is that due to a series of accidents, or we didn't end up being like the European Union, who is a whole bunch of little, I mean, I don't mean to call them small, but there are different
Right.
governments, and they lack that unity that we have in the United States.
That's true. And but I think that in the same way that Brexit in England is dominated by people who really resist that kind of involvement in the EU, the election of the Trump as president is driven by people who also feel that they've been left behind and that they resist the power of the federal government to dictate their lives, especially on issues like civil rights. There's still a strong, I don't know what percentage, I would say 30% of the American white population really doesn't believe in the civil rights movement. That said, as an international program, I make this point. If you recall the Tokyo Olympics, when the American team walks into the stadium, a pretty empty stadium, if you remember, it's the only multiracial team. It's the only team that's thoroughly multiracial. Black, white, brown, yellow. And that's the reason we succeed in the Olympics, because we draw on the talent of all of our citizens in a way that I mean, and the census, the most recent census in 2020 shows we are becoming increasingly a multiracial society. The Asian population and the Hispanic population going much faster. And then in the year 2045 or thereabouts, the whites will be a statistical minority in the United States. On the one hand, that's a cause of celebration. On the other hand, for many white Americans, it's a cause for, alarm. Whites will continue to have the bulk of the economic power and political power, but we're headed towards a truly multiracial future. And what I worry about is that there'll be a backlash, as there has been so many times in the past. As you make a major move forward, if you elect a president who happens to be Black, you hope you're heading towards post-racial America, but instead you get a backlash. And I believe that's what the Trump presidency has been. And I think we're vulnerable to demagogues because we're a democracy. Popular opinion, according to the founders, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. Res publica, things of the public. Not popular, public. The public interest is the long-term interest of the people, which at any given moment, most of the people don't fathom. But to the extent that we are a democracy, we're always going to have one segment of the population, the white population, that's going to resist the multiracial future that is inevitable.
Yeah, well, to stay a little bit longer in politics and our current affairs, I think Trump was the result of having Obama as the first Black president. That I believe that created this reaction like, oh my God, we are losing our privilege. We might as well do something. We might as well put this person here because he represents our insecurities.
I agree with you. I think that the Trump presidency is unimaginable without Obama. I think the phrase "Make America Great Again" means certainly before a man who looked like Obama was president. It also means before Martin Luther King had his dream and the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act were passed. So it's a push, it's that definition of again. And what's been surprising to many of us, including people like me who read the news a lot and know a lot about American history, the Trump presidency has been an airburst in the night to show us that there's a much larger group of people who resist the civil rights movement than I had presumed. I thought we were further along than in truth we were.
Wow. Okay, let's go back to your book. I have two more questions about it. One thing that I was surprised to find out was that the initial intent of these heroes of the Constitution was not to create a revolution to separate from England, but in fact that they wanted representation in the government.
That's right. I mean, they would have been willing. They tried to get the British government to recognize that they had rights as English citizens, and that it was the British government that was behaving in a revolutionary way by denying them their rights to be represented for taxation or legislation purposes. And if the British government had any sense at the moment, they would have recognized that all they had to do was meet them halfway on this issue. And we would have never had the American Revolution. And what would have happened is the same thing that happened with Canada. Over time, we would have become part of the British Commonwealth. We'd still be recognizing the Queen, but we would have our own independence. But it didn't play that way, largely because the leaders of the British government, and that means George III specifically as well, really believed that if they allowed the Americans any degree of independence, the Americans would secede from the empire. And then they thought was a version of the domino theory. If we let the Americans go, then Canada will go, and then Jamaica will go, and then Malta will go, and then India will go. And so it was the British government that essentially forced the revolution on the Americans, thinking that it would be a war that would be easily won, when of course, in fact, I don't think the British ever had a chance to win it.
Right. And one last surprise, or one other thing that I learned from your book, is that at the writing of the Constitution, there was already the discord with slavery, that some states were opposed to slavery, and then some, of course, for economic reasons, they wanted to have slavery, and in order to keep that union, then the evil of slavery was accepted.
I think the Constitutional Convention, the radicals and the abolitionists called it a compromise with death. And from a purely moral point of view, that's true. From a historical and political point of view, it was a compromise with the sections, the South. And the argument at the Constitution was, if we face frontally the slavery question and insist on its end, even gradually, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia are not going to join the Union. And nobody knows how it would have played out if we'd called their bluff. But if there are two great tragedies in the American founding, one is the failure to reach a just accommodation with the Native Americans. The other is the failure to end slavery. But it wasn't going to be easy. I mean, in other words, at any rate, it's the debate over the Constitution replicates the debate that's morally clear but politically insoluble.
Wow. Well, I continue finding so many parallels between the time now and the time of 1773, 1783 to our present days. And I guess the readers will have to buy your book to find out more of those parallels. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you do?
The title of the book?
Yes, one more time, the title of the book and where can the listeners follow your work?
The book is entitled The Cause, the American Revolution and its Discontents, 1773 to 1783, published by Liverite, which is a brand within Norton, available in most bookstores and in Amazon.
Professor Ellis, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.